Okay, we're ready to get started. My name is Earl Taylor. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, since 1961, nonprofit MSI has been the bridge between marketing theory and business practice. We fund research by leading academics worldwide on topics voted by our 70-plus corporate sponsors and disseminate results through members-only events and a variety of publications. I'm very pleased to welcome you to another MSI For Members by Members webinar. This is a series of webinars on subjects related to MSI's current research priority topics. First, I'd like to point out that the Q&A module on your screen, please use this feature to send through any questions you have for Amitabha during the presentation. We'll gather the questions and have a brief Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And if you send these questions through for Amitabha during the webinar, please be sure to send the questions directly to MSI Meetings, the tab for MSI Meetings. Also, Amitabha's slides, as well as the entire webinar, will be available for download on the MSI member website. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. Amitabha Chattopadhyay, I hope I said that more or less right, of INSEAD has kindly agreed to present today's webinar on the new emerging market multinationals. There is a bio for Amitabha on our website, but let me just mention a few of the highlights. Amitabha is the GlaxoSmithKline Chaired Professor of Corporate Innovation and Professor of Marketing at INSEAD. Prior to joining INSEAD, he had been a faculty member at the University of British Columbia and McGill University. Amitabha is an expert on branding. He's recently published an award-winning book, The New Emerging Market Multinationals, 4 Strategies for Disrupting Markets and Building Brands, and I believe that will be the basis of some of his remarks today. He's published over 60 peer-reviewed articles in a variety of leading journals. He serves on editorial review boards of several top academic journals, and among other things, he's a member of the board of the Association of Consumer Research and a fellow of the Asian Consumer Insights Institute. His areas of expertise, in addition to branding, include marketing strategy, communication strategy, marketing in emerging markets, and international marketing. And he's taught in a variety of executive MBA-type programs across the world. Amitabha holds a PhD from the University of Florida, and we're very pleased to have him with us today to talk about the new emerging marketing multinationals, disrupting markets, and building brands. So, Amitabha?
Thanks, Earl. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me quickly let me share the slides. Okay. Hi, can you see the slides, everybody?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to do this webinar, and I'm delighted that so many of you are here today. The work I'm going to present is, as was just mentioned, based on the book that came out a couple of years ago, and the book was co-authored with 2 other academics, Rajiv Batra at the University of Michigan and Aisha Gulosumar at Koch University. Really, why did we get into this work and what are the takeaways from it are the focus of today's webinar. And the work began with a conversation between Rajiv Batra and myself about 5-6 years ago now. And what we were struck by was that, if you look at the academic literature, books were being published where top scholars in strategy were saying things like, evidence suggests that EMNCs, or emerging market multinational corporations, are still weak when it comes to developing brands. And their argument basically was that, well, these companies are smaller in size, so they have weaker financial resources. To take one example, let's say India's Mahindra & Mahindra has about a $7 billion business in the automotive space, and it competes with Volkswagen, which is 20 times bigger than it at about $140 billion in revenues. And so how can we expect a Mahindra to be competitive and have a branded proposition in the marketplace? The second argument sort of that underlay these academic arguments that were being put forth was the fact that, emerging markets have negative connotations. So if you think made in China, perhaps you think of melamine in milk. If you think made in India, perhaps you think of abject poverty or cows on the street. Made in Brazil, maybe violence in the streets, or again, the favelas and the poverty there. So there is, how can companies located in these geographies have good quality? How can we trust them? And therefore, how can they build brands? And then the third argument that comes forth is that, well, these companies are relatively young. So if you look at most of the big Chinese companies that we think about today, for example, Lenovo or Haier or BYD, they weren't around 30 years ago. So they're very young. They've hardly at all globalized in many cases, and so they have less customer insight in terms of global customer insight. They have less brand building skills and lower global managing capability. And so therefore, at best, we can think of these companies as making cheap products to sell, or perhaps becoming OEM suppliers to players like Apple or others. But if you look at the reality out there, you suddenly start noticing a difference. So Natura is a Brazilian cosmetics player. It has shown quite striking growth between 2002 and 2010. Its revenues jumped from about R1 billion to 5 billion real, so five-fold increase in a matter of 8 years. If you take Russia's MTC, which is a mobile telephone player, it's a network operator, its revenues have grown from about $1 billion to 10. So a tenfold increase again in the same period. If we come to India, we see Mahindra, the company that I mentioned a moment ago, it's grown from about 75 billion rupees, which is about $1.25 billion back then in 2006, to about 7 billion today. So that's again quite dramatic growth. And then Haier of China between 2004 and 2010 grew from about a little under $1 billion to about $6 billion by 2010. So very, very dramatic growth. And perhaps we would consider that today companies like Natura, Haier, and others are actually playing the branded game. And this is important, and some companies have begun to understand this. So in a 2009 HBR article, Jeffrey Immelt, along with Vijay Govindarajan and Chris Trimble, noted that GE has tremendous respect for traditional rivals like Siemens, Philips, and Rolls-Royce, but it knows how to compete with them. They will never destroy GE. However, the emerging giants very well could. So there is a concern that these companies seem to have come from nowhere and grown to become quite sizable and significant competitors. So if we consider Lenovo today, it is the leading player in the PC space, and having now acquired IBM server business, is a big player in that space. And with Motorola that it acquired from Google just the other day, it is now poised to become a very significant player with a storied name in the mobile handset business. So there seems to be something going on, and we can't simply expect that the world that we thought we had, where emerging market companies simply played as OEM suppliers or makers of cheap products, that has changed and it has gone forever. And why has it changed? So in putting together the research for our book, 4 things really jumped out at us. Number 1 was the winning mindset. Number 2, frugal product and process innovation. 3, focus. And 4, customer centricity. Let me elaborate on each of these points. So one of the things that really struck us as we went from company to company across different markets was this self-belief. And this self-belief manifested itself in different ways. So in China, for example, we heard the refrain very commonly, "It's our turn." Any of you who've been to China on business, I'm sure have heard the same refrain. And there is this genuine belief that it is the time for China's companies to, become great. You get the same sentiment, perhaps not expressed quite so bluntly, when you go to India or you go to Turkey. There is a belief that we can win, and it came about in different ways. So, for example, in China, it came about simply because it became the factory to the world. And having become the factory to the world, it acquired several very, very fundamental capabilities, which then gave it this sense of being able to rise. What were those capabilities? Well, number 1, as the factory to the world, they learned how to manufacture to the standards that the most demanding consumers in the world expect. They were able to develop global supply chains to be able to supply the OEM partners that they had around the world. And the third thing was that they, by manufacturing for the branded players such as Apple, they were able to understand what consumers in the developed markets actually wanted. So this kind of set the game up for companies like Lenovo or Haier or BYD or any number of other players like TCL to jump in. In India, it was a little different. So for example, in 1991, India was bankrupt. And kicking and screaming, it was forced into opening its economy. And Indian companies at that time were terrified that they would simply perish as multinationals poured in. The fact was that by 2000, many of them actually had survived and were doing much better than they had been under the license Raj prior to 1991. And there was this sudden belief that perhaps we can do something, and this belief exploded with the acquisition by the Tata Group of Tetley, the tea brand from the UK, making Tata Tea the world's #2 player in the tea business after Unilever. And this kind of gave the sense that we can do it to not only just the Tata Group companies, but to Indian companies at large. And as they say, the rest is history. So for different reasons, confidence was acquired. And this confidence led people to work incredibly hard. So if you go to China, there are no Sundays. When I was doing work on this book and visited China for interviews, people would give me interviews on Saturday afternoons and Sunday mornings, and I'd say, by the way, you do know it's the weekend, and they'd say, yeah, no problem. And so there is no concept of weekends. They work incredibly hard, and so 80-hour weeks are commonplace. Secondly, they do that for much less money. In fact, what's really interesting is that, in conversations with Infosys from India, they pointed out that the expat managers that they have, that they send on mission to various parts of the world actually earn less than locally hired people. This inverts the game that is played in the multinational context where expat packages tend to be far higher. And the third thing is that, these people are willing to go pretty much anywhere So whereas perhaps a top manager at a multinational firm would not be happy to be sent off to Nigeria, a Chinese or an Indian manager feels that it's their duty to be able to go and serve their company in Nigeria or wherever that might be considered a very hardship location by the typical multinational corporations executives. And the net result is then you get top people working incredibly hard for relatively less salary and working in corners of the world which would be hard-pressed to find people among the multinational players. Now add to this self-belief innovation. So historically, the argument has been that these emerging market firms basically survive by arbitrage on labor. But what you notice now is that there is a significant amount of innovation that's driving their success. And part of that innovation is on the product, and part of it is on the process. So let's talk about product innovation for a minute. Mahindra & Mahindra of India competes by putting more engineers behind R&D projects. Engineers are relatively cheap. They pay top dollar for a few key executives. So the head of R&D, for example, may be somebody that gets hired from a developed world company who's paid a top expat salary, but then the millions of thousands of people who work and report to into that top manager get paid local salaries. So it allows them to have, if you will, the thinking that is world-class to drive R&D, but the worker bees, if you will, are paid local salaries. They also tend to pay lower salaries and larger bonuses, which means that you make your costs variable as opposed to fixed. And they're also more strategic in their hiring. So instead of, let's say, in India, going to the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, or the IITs to be able to recruit, they go to a somewhat lesser school to recruit. In China, this may be, instead of going to Tsinghua University, going to the Harbin Institute of Technology. And by doing that, you get actually as talented a person, because the competition in these countries is brutal. So the top end of the second-tier schools tend to be just as good as the people in the top-tier schools. But their expectations are lower, and they're willing to accept somewhat lower salaries. And because these companies are iconic companies in their home countries, they tend to, feel very happy with being able to work there, and they work extremely hard. The net result of this has been that the ability to generate innovation fast and at low cost has been huge. So consider Mahindra, the first model of SUV that it developed from scratch in 2002. It did it in 18 months at a cost of $120 million. In Detroit, it would have taken at least 3 years and $1 billion. So faster, cheaper innovation is a key aspect of the success story. But I think more than the product innovation space, process innovation has been a very important element. Consider China's BYD. It was founded in 1995, and in the late 90s, it saw an opportunity in lithium-ion batteries. So it decided to go to Japan, which housed the world leaders in lithium-ion battery manufacturing, to buy a manufacturing line. At the time, they discovered that the cost of one manufacturing line, because of the clean room that was required, costs in the ballpark of $10 million. The paid-up capital of BYD was a mere $250,000. Clearly, they could not buy a manufacturing line from Japan. So they innovated, and they created the clean box. The clean box, as you can see in the picture, is simply a transparent box that sits on top of a frame where you can stand outside it, and putting your hands through the gloved receptacles that you can see in the picture, you can manipulate objects inside the clean box. This innovation let BYD enter into the lithium-ion battery space, and not only did it allow them to enter, but it changed the way lithium-ion batteries were made forever. Why? Well, first of all, it took a large fixed cost and broke it down into a variable cost, making it incremental, scalable, modular, and flexible. So now, as my manufacturing demand picks up, I can scale the number of boxes. As the demand requires different quantities of different types of batteries, I can flexibly and modularly set up my lines, which makes it possible for a company with limited capital to enter the space. Secondly, it increased labor productivity, because working inside the clean room requires wearing special garments, kind of like a spacesuit, so that you don't bring any dust or breathe moisture into the clean room, which meant that your 8-hour shift wasn't a full 8-hour shift, because there was a prep time in and a prep time out. BYD's innovation eliminated this prep time. The result has been that BYD has been able to produce batteries at far lower cost than the then major players of lithium-ion batteries. And today, 25% of the cell phone battery market is owned by BYD, and it's the global #1 in batteries. It's a company that celebrates its 20th year this year. The third reason for success is focus. And these companies have been really narrowly focused. Some of them have focused narrowly on segments. So for example, India's Wipro focuses on the Fortune 1000 CXOs. Mindray, the Chinese medical diagnostics player, focuses on smaller hospitals and clinics in 3rd and 4th tier cities, bypassing the Beijings and the Guangzhous of this world. Chigo, a Chinese maker of air conditioners, focuses on intermediaries. Fitra from Turkey focuses on ceramics for the bathroom. Natura, the company I mentioned earlier, only makes cosmetic products using active ingredients from plants used by the indigenous people of the Amazon. Others have focused on a limited number of brands. So for example, Grupo Modelo, which was still independent at the time when we were doing this research and was not a part of AB InBev, had a huge portfolio of beers, but one beer that we know and love across the world is Corona. So they go international with this single brand, and the result has been that Corona today is the #1 selling imported beer in the United States, having knocked out Heineken from that #1 spot. Right, so why this laser focus? Because we need to have impact with limited resources. How limited? When I was speaking to Wipro, the CMO of Wipro indicated to me that the revenues of Wipro are the size of IBM, their major competitors' marketing budget. So that creates a huge challenge. So the result was that Wipro had to think more carefully about how to deploy its resources. So they said, well, given our target audience is Fortune 1000 CXOs, if we target the key gateway cities in the US, UK, and Japan, which were their main markets, we should be able to build brand awareness. So they bought lighted panels in these airports. They also said, well, these top CXOs that we are interested in go to the World Economic Forum, and at the World Economic Forum, there are buses that ferry people from the hotels to the conference venue. They bought the buses, and there were 8 of these buses, I believe, and wrapped them with Wipro advertising so that every day during the World Economic Forum, getting in and out of the buses, these executives would see advertisement from Wipro. So by being focused, they were able to deliver in terms of creating awareness, which simply wouldn't have been possible if they had not been focused. The last reason for their success is that they begin with the target consumer. Let me use the second example because I need to get to the implications for you, and I have another 5 to 10 minutes. So Mahindra & Mahindra builds SUVs. Now, as I understand it, in most car manufacturing, the platform is the first to get designed, and then the body gets designed after the fact. Mahindra has turned the process around. They say, well, what the consumer experiences is the shell inside which they sit. And so for them, the process of designing a new car begins by understanding the space that the customer experiences. Having designed that first, then they work saying, well, okay, to deliver a certain kind of performance given this shell, what kind of a platform are we going to need? So it fundamentally shifts the development process from one that is engineering focused, starting with the platform, to one that is customer focused, starting with the part of the product that consumers seek. Now, so what are the lessons that we can have for the wider audience, shall we say? First of all, we can say that many of the things that we've talked about actually apply to any challenger business. So for example, if you take a Clorox and you say, well, it competes in many product categories head-on with Procter & Gamble. Procter is about 20 times bigger than Clorox. So in a sense, a Clorox is much like an emerging market multinational. They have limited resources and limited capabilities. Perhaps they don't have the baggage of negative country of origin, but other than that, they are very similar. So what can we say for these types of companies? We can say that, well, the first step in sort of building your business is to really deepen and leverage your initial capabilities in your home market. Having done that, you need to then start focusing on customers that are similar to your home customers in the international markets. So an interesting example would be the way Mahindra Automotives worked in their tractor business, Mahindra Tractors went from India straight into the US. Why? Because they said, well, we're looking for customer groups that want an inexpensive, small, durable tractor. Hobby farmers in the US were the largest group of consumers who wanted such a product outside of India. And the result was that their move out of India was into the United States, where they now have 3 assembly plants, and they're doing very, very well. The third point would be to enter markets where perhaps they don't expose themselves to the best and the strongest competition. So Saudi Arabia, Savola Group will say, well, we're big players in the oil business, but edible oil business, but we tend to target markets where Unilever isn't present because Unilever is a competitor that we would rather not get into head-on competition with. So criteria for selecting markets to enter are markets where Unilever is not present. And then The fourth thing is that they focus on existing customers and try to get a larger share of wallet rather than acquiring new customers, because that's a more expensive business. The second thing is that invest in innovation, okay? Create faster innovation cycles. A great example is LG Electronics in the United States. LG for 30 years had been present in the US till they, with their Gold Star brand, and had gone nowhere. In 2002, they introduced the LG brand into the US market, and in washing machines, refrigerators, basically white goods, they fundamentally changed the innovation cycle to the point that by 2007, they were the #1 brand as defined by the average selling price, as defined by customer satisfaction of J.D. Powers, and as ranked by Consumer Reports in that space. A fundamental element was rapid innovation, okay? And you can't bet the farm on this because you're small, and so what you need to do is to put things out into the marketplace, test things in a small scale, and then scale up as things look good. I'm going to skip that slide and move right along. Building your brand internationally is going to take a long-term mindset, so having a short-term mindset, don't go there. Build your quality first and invest systematically behind brand building. Again, Wipro is a great example. So they not only did the buses and panels that I talked about earlier, but they also bought wraps in magazines like The Economist and Businessweek, and in newspapers like the New York Times. Why wraps? Well, wraps cost more, but wraps can be focused. So I could say, well, I want to send it to X, Y, and Z on your subscription list, which means that the cost per 1,000 relevant eyeball is actually far lower. They then teamed up with the Wharton School to have a opt-in e-newsletter called the CIO Series, with a rub-off of the Wharton brand name. They did case studies with INSEAD, which again has the same kind of rub-off effect. And then when people come to Bangalore and you are a senior executive of a Fortune 1000 firm, they know the limo services that pick up these executives. And they give the limo service the bag that you can see in front of you, which contains a little puzzle inside it. It's called the magic box. And if you can open it, then you can register yourself for a prize. And of course, through this registration process, they capture your name, they know you're in Bangalore, and they know how to get in touch with you. The journey is about an hour, and this box has been set up so that it takes about at least 45 minutes to figure out how to open it. Now, and then we build a fabulous campus where once you come, you realize that this is not what you would typically expect of an Indian business. So you take people through all the way from building brand experience, through engagement, through the magic box, and then to your facility where you see a world-class enterprise. And today they are able to bid for mission-critical projects at prices that are comparable to those charged by IBM and Accenture. Right, what about for the large multinationals? Clearly, I mean, one way to compete with these companies would be to harness the power of the much vaster budgets. So IBM's marketing budget is the size of Wipro's annual revenues, and so it allows IBM to be able to deploy this budget in a way that would make it very difficult for a Wipro or an Infosys or a TCS from India to grab new customers. Secondly, MNCs need to think about a more nuanced brand architecture strategy. So for example, in India, Novartis has launched an initiative called Arogya Parivar, which is a Novartis initiative. It's a endorsed brand by Novartis. This allows Novartis to target less affluent customers with a whole new suite of drugs which are not sold to the main pharmaceutical outlets, and creates an employment structure that's outside of the traditional Novartis umbrella, allowing it to achieve lower cost structures just like the local firms can. It's interesting that some international firms have been around in the emerging markets longer than the emerging market firms themselves. So consider Unilever. Ever since I was a child, I've known Unilever in India. Marico, which competes in the hair care space with Unilever, was founded in 1985. So even domestically, there is greater insight on customers, local customers that resides with an organization like Unilever. Exploiting those would be a way to compete. And then as the EMNCs have only recently internationalized, their organization structures are not yet sophisticated enough for the rapid transfer of insights from one market to the next and to be able to deploy against those insights. And so that's another area where multinationals can compete quite effectively. What can be learned from the emerging market multinationals? Well, first of all, cut costs relentlessly across all levels of the value chain. Let me give you an example. So Lenovo today has moved its marketing department out of China into India. It is housed in Bangalore, India. Why Bangalore, India? Well, India has very good market research capabilities, Indian companies. Number two, Indian companies have very good capability for developing marketing collateral. So for example, Slumdog Millionaire, which was produced for $5 million, won several technical awards for cinematography and editing, suggesting that for a fraction of the price that you would pay in the United States, you could get as good quality production values and editing out of India. And so why would you house your marketing department anywhere else? Interestingly, this is challenging for multinational firms because so far the outsourcing has been for workers who are far away, who don't sit in the next office. But when you outsource the marketing department to India, it's a whole different story. It's the person sitting next to you. And that requires a more, you really have to think about it. And I think that that's an important lesson that the EMNCs offer to the triad-based multinational corporations. Second thing is, I think that you need to more seriously focus on the emerging markets, not just say, well, there are consumers there. We actually make the product for the consumers at home. Let's kind of strip it down or sell them yesterday's models because that doesn't work. I think you really have to think about what you're doing, because in many categories today, volume growth is in the emerging markets, and simply by saying, I'm going to do business as usual, you are probably not going to capture this growth opportunity. Let me give you an example of the kind of innovation that's necessary. So GE, for example, has set up a R&D lab in Bangalore, India, to be able to tap to tap the opportunity in India. It started, like every multinational corporation does, by trying to strip away elements from its flagship products to make a cheap version. But that simply didn't work. So then GE decided to try and see, can we actually design a product from scratch for the Indian market, leading to the Mac I for India, which is in the picture that you see on the slide. The Mac I is an ultra-portable ECG machine that is battery operated and does 500 ECGs on a single charge. It has actually dropped the price of an ECG to less than $1, around 25 cents to be precise, from what used to be about $5 in the past. The Mac I sells for $500 US compared to $10,000 for the full-sized ECG machine, yet this $500 ECG machine produces an ECG just as accurately as that $10,000 machine. So this 95% price drop was only possible because GE started from scratch and they fought long and hard and made innovations. So for example, the printer for the ECG is the printer that you have in the handheld credit card machines that you see in restaurants. They took that printer, they tweaked the software drivers to be able to improve on the quality of the printed output, and they used that rather than a dedicated module, which would have been the normal way that GE would have progressed. So by completely changing the innovation process, they have been able to create a machine at 5% of the cost of the original. This machine not only sells in India and other emerging markets, but it today sells in, for example, the United States, in markets such as, let's say, I don't know, in the small towns in the prairies where maybe there's a GP who previously needed to send customers to a hospital 100 miles away, but today can do an ECG because for $500 he or she can keep one at the office and need be do the ECG with the patient that shows up. Let me stop there because I think I've run out of time and take questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Tava. We do have a question from Sergey, and he asked, do you see any capabilities that enable established multinational corporations to transfer insights or products or innovations across markets speedily?
Well, I think the organizations, the traditional multinationals do have organization structures that are capable of transferring innovations across markets, and I think that actually is their strength because the emerging market multinationals still tend to operate in very country-centric ways. So it's the way multinationals were perhaps 30, 40 years ago as more multi-domestic corporations. So today, that, I would argue, is one of the advantages that the traditional multinationals have, and that would be an effective way to compete. Clearly, the GE example that I used, they were able to develop the Mac I in India, and they have created opportunities with the Mac I back at home in the United States and in other parts of the developed world. I used the example of Novartis's Arogya Parivar initiative in India. They have now actually moved that regionally, and they are experimenting with that initiative in Kenya and in Vietnam, and they will scale it once they've figured out how to manage country differences. So this is clearly a core capability of the top multinationals.
I have a related question to that, and that is some theories about how emerging markets and companies will converge and look a lot more like the developed countries and the companies in those countries when they hit a certain stage of maturation, let's say. On the other hand, you might argue that in many cases, given the cultural and other kinds of differences that these companies are coming from, they may actually find a very different business model or way of organizing and working. What are your thoughts about that? Do you see the emerging multinationals looking more and more like traditional multinationals from developed countries, or are they likely to maybe develop different models that we're not familiar with yet?
So I think that emerging market multinationals are frugal because when you come from a poor country, frugality is something that you grow up with. So when I was talking to Infosys in India, one of the persons that I interviewed mentioned that, look, we had a conversation with Carlos Ghosn of Renault-Nissan, and he asked us, can we do something for them in terms of a specific outcome? And he said that, our response was, give us $500,000 and 5 people, and we'll figure out how to tackle this problem, at least some initial specs, and then we can see whether to invest more behind it. And Mr. Ghosn's reaction was, if I'd asked that at Renault-Nissan, I would have been given a budget of $50 million and 50 people to take the project forward. So this idea that we start small and we test and learn as we go forward because resources are scarce is a fundamental thing to people who've developed in a resource-scarce world. And I think that mindset is something that you see that fundamentally differentiates multinationals from the emerging market multinationals, and that's not going to go away in the short run, at least. I mean, maybe in 100 years, who knows, but at least in the foreseeable future, that, I think, will see a difference. I mean, Lenovo today is a gigantic player. It's the #1 player in PCs, but it is still frugal.
Okay, thanks. I think there's a related question that just came in from Ana Maria, and that is the role of corporate social responsibility in emerging multinationals. Is this something that they accept as part of doing business, especially as they move into developed markets? Is this, again, maybe a new concept to them? Or where do you see?
That's a great question, and I think that there's a real misunderstanding in the developed world to think that emerging market companies are actually less responsible. In the Fortune survey of the top 25 companies for corporate governance, Infosys featured as one of the companies. It's an Indian company. The Tatas have historically been known for their philanthropy. So the Indian Institute of Science is funded by the Tata Group. 60% of the Tata holdings are by a trust company because it believes that doing good is a fundamental part of the organization's need. Mahindras have a similar philosophy. So I mean, if you look at many emerging market companies, they come from a deep belief in corporate social responsibility. Just like in the developed world, there are companies that speak about CSR but do nothing. The same holds in the emerging markets. But I would absolutely not paint emerging market companies with a brush that says that, only when they get into the developed market do they need to learn about CSR. That's absolutely untrue.
I think you make a good point there that we perhaps tend to take that for granted or assume that, and it sounds like it would be a good move on the part of emerging multinationals to emphasize that and make sure that we are better aware perhaps of their CSR and related activities.
I think that's a big point.
Yeah, and on that topic, there's a related question in terms of acceptance of emerging multinationals owning brands. Dipanjan asked us if there might be a shift in the wind here in the future where a company like Tata can, own an iconic brand like Jaguar and say, we're an emerging multinational, but and this is an iconic brand, but we're not in some ways compromising or infringing on that because we are, equal to any multinational company out there. So I'm curious, it sort of comes back to where you began with some of the negative stereotypes associated with emerging countries, emerging companies. Can they sort of overcome that over time, perhaps, and not face a backlash as they acquire brands that have iconic associations?
Well, clearly with the Jaguar Land Rover acquisition in 2008, the Tatas have done a remarkable job. So if I move my slides forward to the last slide that I had that I didn't show because I thought that we needed to keep time for Q&A, the fact of the matter is that, Tata's today, the largest part of their profits comes from Jaguar Land Rover because they've been able to manage Ford sold it because they couldn't manage it profitably. That's why Ford sold it. The Tatas have taken it and they have transformed it. So clearly, they're doing something right in terms of taking, today you walk down the streets of Shanghai and Beijing, Land Rovers are noticeable. There wasn't a single Land Rover 10 years ago if you walked around, perhaps not a single, that's an exaggeration, but you certainly didn't notice Land Rovers in the streets of Shanghai and Beijing. So they are doing something right, and they manage their acquisitions very carefully. So for example, Tata Tea, when it bought Tetley back in 2000, it was a tea garden owning company. It owned a large number of gardens in India, and its value proposition to Indian consumers was from bush to cup. They bought Tetley because they didn't understand the branding game. They didn't understand building international brands. They created dual headquarters in Calcutta, which is where they were traditionally headquarters, and in London to make the Tetley employees feel comfortable with the acquisition. They created a management infrastructure with the chairperson of Tata Tea as the head of that management body, which included executives from Tetley and from Tata Tea. And it was only in 2010, they rebranded themselves as Tata Global Beverages. They had sold their tea gardens and they had become a branded tea player. And in 2012, they closed the London headquarters and shifted everything to India because now there was comfort between the acquired and the acquirer, and it didn't make sense to have the expense of dual headquarters. So they've been extremely adroit in terms of managing acquisitions. And it's interesting because one a priori might have thought that the large multinationals with a history of acquisition should have done a better job, would do a better job because but they don't. So there's a recent paper, I forget by whom, which shows that the emerging market multinationals have a higher success rate with acquisitions than the developed world players.
Well, that's a really interesting way to wrap up, I think, coming back full circle to the question about the brand. We shouldn't assume going forward that that's going to be a negative for these emerging companies, that in fact, as you just illustrated, they're quite good at learning from the existing brands and approaches and making them their own. I want to thank you very much, Amitabha, for the presentation today and for fielding the questions. There were some additional questions that we didn't have time to get to, but we'll make sure that you see those. And if others would like to follow up with Amitabha, there will be information on the final slide about how you can reach him. Again, we want to thank the members of the MSI audience for participating in this member-to-member webinar series. I want to mention that we do have an upcoming webinar on March 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with David Schweidel of Emory University, and he'll be talking about profiting from consumer data, specifically data from consumer-generated online websites, discussion groups, and so forth. He and a co-author have recently published an interesting book on how to use data from these sources to really understand your consumers, to track your brand health, and so forth. So plan to join us for that next webinar, March 25th at 1 p.m. You'll be receiving notices about that, and it's on our website. And again, very much want to thank Amitabha for an interesting talk and for being part of our webinar series.
Well, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.